With Volume 2 covering the events of Fortune Lover, has Katarina done enough to actually avoid her bad end? Well, we're gonna find out. Hello everybody and welcome to another light novel review. I'm Justus R. Stone and my channel's all about light novels, reviews like this one, news, and it's also the home of the Light Novel Podcast. So if you love light novels or maybe you're just starting to get interested in them, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of my future light novel content. In this video, I'm going to be talking about volume number 2 of My Next Life as a Villainess. All routes lead to doom. This one written by Satoru Yamaguchi with illustrations by Nami Hidaka. It's released officially in English by J-Novel Club in both digital and print formats. Although if you're looking up J-Novel, it's listed under the J-Novel Heart imprint for the print release. It's got a translation by Shirley Yeung. If you want to pick this one up, I've got links in the description down below. In this second volume of My Next Life as a Villainess, we're going to the academy, we're going to school, and this is actually where the events of the Fortune Lover Otome Game occurred, the very game that Katarina has been preparing for this whole time to try and avoid all the bad ends that are about to come flying at her within the next year. Of course, she's also going to meet the heroine of that Otome game, a girl named Maria, and there's going to also be another character introduced, the class president of the school, Sirius. Now, these characters are going to be pretty important and play a pretty big role in this volume, and unfortunately that means that a lot of our characters from volume number 1 are gonna get a little bit sidelined. There's not a lot of focus on many of them. In fact, really, Jord is probably the only one who gets some major screen time in this one, along with Katarina. Now, this one comes to an end and basically finishes the Fortune Lover game. In fact, I have been told that this is where the web novel ended for this particular story, and of course it was popular enough that the author has since continued it for a number of volumes beyond. Volume number 2 of My Next Life as a Villainess actually does quite a few things good and improves a lot on the first volume. One of the biggest complaints I think a lot of people have with that first volume is that it feels very repetitive when you read a whole chapter, and then the rest of the chapter is basically those exact same events, just told from another person's point of view. Now, this does happen a little bit in this second volume, but thankfully, most of that time when that happens, it contains a wealth of more important information about that particular character who is now seeing things differently, or also includes events that we perhaps did not see when we were following Katarina's point of view. So it doesn't feel quite as stale and stagnant for about half the book as what I believe a lot of people felt in the first volume. Also, the second volume is far more linear. It actually has a feel that it's driving forward as a story because the very format of it is being told about a year in her school life. And so there is this far more concrete passage of time. And because we know that we're leading up to a very specific point at the end of this book, it makes the story feel like there's far more forward drive and that there's far more going on, and that it doesn't just feel like a series of tiny little vignettes that move along. It also means that pretty much the first volume, and again, I liked the first volume, I'm not slagging on it, but let's be fair, that first volume was very repetitive. Pretty much all of those individual stories were character has sort of some kind of issue, character meets Katarina, Katarina makes them feel good about themselves because she's, just completely honest and hard on her sleeve and goofy and clueless and likable, and character falls in love with Katarina and the chapter. Well, except, okay, we're going to do the chapter, but from that person's point of view. So, it is rather repetitive, that first volume, as much as I will say I did enjoy it. This one, again, it avoids a lot of that repetition and that feeling that every single chapter is basically the same, just using different characters, because we have this push forward. There is much more of a sense of actual story going on in this volume that I think it really benefits a lot from. Also, it just absolutely continues that incredibly warm, gushy, mushy, kind of funny comedy that we've come to enjoy in this series. I mean, Maria, who is the heroine of the Fortune Lover game, is this incredibly sweet character, but I did enjoy that they gave her a much more fleshed out and substantial backstory. She wasn't just this really one-dimensional, perfect character that we were supposed to just self-insert into. She does have a backstory that's kind of rough and shows that she's really worked hard to overcome a lot of things and be this good person. And it was really nice to see that this character was able to overcome those things, and that Katarina, despite her fear, let's be honest, fear of this person, was kind of able to overcome that herself and see that, you know what, this is just a really nice girl, and maybe the best thing to do is just let our relationship kind of happen and be friends. And there was really this nice warmth to this book in the beginning. I'll get to a little bit later, but I think the thing is, like, I haven't read the first volume in a very long time. And so it was kind of surprising to me to sit down and read this second volume and find myself very quickly just kind of settling back into the world and settling back into these characters and laughing along with the goofy hijinks of the series and, you know, just kind of shaking your head at how incredibly clueless Katarina can often be, but at the same time just how absolutely charming she is in her own thick-headed way. That said, let's face it, this is an Otome game, and if you've played any Otome games, you know that they can have a habit of getting a little bit dark towards the end, especially depending on what kind of an end you're working towards. So I did kind of feel with this book that there was a very big tonal shift about 2/3 of the way through the book. It's not a deal breaker by any means, but I will admit that I kind of found myself a little bit taken aback that there was so much kind of light, fluffy, comedy, heartwarming type stuff, and then all of a sudden it seemed like a fairly quick shift, and whoa, it got a little bit dark. Again, not inappropriate given the thing that it's supposed to be emulating, this Otome game, but yeah, it did kind of shift gears pretty quick and kind of caught me a little off guard. The other thing that was introduced in this book that I kind of felt like it wasn't a horrible thing, but I kind of wish the author had done more to build up to it. It kind of felt like it was just something that the author suddenly had this idea that it was like, oh, hey, you know what? I'm going to have this happen now. And it didn't quite jive with me based on the events that had happened in the first book. It was kind of a tie-in to Katarina's previous life. I won't spoil it in any way, but I do kind of feel like there wasn't enough of a lead-in to it, or there wasn't enough to kind of explain why now. Because let's face it, this book is taking place several years. Well, okay, there was a big jump in years in book one, but you know what I mean? Like, the bulk of book one took place, and then we had a big time skip of a couple of years, and yet it just didn't seem like the book did enough to build up why this was kind of coming up at this moment. I know I'm kind of being a little nebulous about it, but yeah, it's just, I don't want to spoil it for you. But if you've seen the anime, you probably know what it is anyway. My whole feeling on it was basically that the author was throwing it in there as kind of like a safety net, as a way of saying, well, you know, maybe I can use this to expand the story down the road if I need to go beyond this whole fortune lover thing, which somebody was telling me as of volume 6 is exactly what happens. So I guess it makes sense in the larger scheme of things, but again, this was another little thing in the second book that I found a little bit jarring, and that it kind of took me a little bit out of the story. And one thing that I don't know whether you'll like it or not like it, or find it jarring or not jarring, I guess it depends as a reader. I enjoyed that when it really counted, Katarina seemed to be able to have much more empathy and recognize a deep-seated wound, emotional wound in a character. This is something that Katarina has generally been very dense about, and that she really hasn't seemed to recognize in other characters up until this point. And it kind of feels like she always just gives people what they need just because of who she is, not because she recognizes that they need something. So in a way, I was kind of happy to see her as a character be able to recognize something in a person as opposed to just kind of stumbling into it. At the same time, though, it was a little bit weird because I'm like, where was that insight into people and how they feel, I don't know, for the last 10 years? And I know that it probably sounds like I'm complaining a lot about these particular items. And I just want to say that, yeah, those are things that kind of took me a little bit out of the story at first. But overall, how this book progressed, like I said, I did think there were a lot of improvements over the first volume. The lack of verbatim over and over again. The fact that the story had far more forward-driving motion and seemed to have much higher consequences, obviously, because this is the moment that she's going to hit that bad end or not. All of those things I thought were an improvement over volume number 1. I also really just find this an absolutely charming and endearing series. I've really enjoyed reading these characters, which was why I was kind of a little down on the fact that some of the characters blended a little bit too much into the background because of the obvious focus on the newer characters. However, at the same time, I thought Maria was an absolutely charming character that I was glad to see added into the book. And I have to say that I'm kind of all for the all-girl harem thing as opposed to involving any of the men in this situation. I kind of think like Katarina should end up with one of the girls when this is all said and done. That's kind of my feeling on it, and I think that would work best overall. So overall, this second volume was incredibly enjoyable. I'm really glad that I've read these 2 books, that I got to spend time with these kind of funny, adorable characters, and we did talk a lot more in depth about this, full of spoilers, in a recent light novel podcast. I'll put a link up above. We just only covered these first 2 books, so we kind of tore them apart a little bit more. So if you're all good with spoilers and you want to hear sort of some further thoughts and more in-depth spoiler-related thoughts to this whole thing, you can check out that podcast episode. As to where the story goes from here, and as to whether I'm going to read more of it, it's kind of a weird feeling, because I really enjoy these characters, so I'm very tempted to read more of this series, but at the same time, the way this second book ends, and as I said, apparently this was the initial ending of the web novel, it's a very satisfying kind of end. It doesn't exactly let you know what's going to happen with the rest of their lives, but nonetheless, it was kind of a nice way that if you don't want to come back to this series for more, it's definitely worth checking out these first 2 volumes, but I kind of have to say that I just like these characters enough that regardless, I'll probably read more of it anyway. In this video, I'd like to say a special thanks to Michaela Werner, Jean-Luc Chartier, Mirage, and New Valaric for their support on Patreon, as well as the support of all of my patrons who allow me to keep making videos here on this channel, as well as supporting other projects like the Light Novel Podcast, EnglishLightNovels.com, and another upcoming project, the Light Novel Database, which is well in development, and I'll have lots more to say about that in future videos. For my next review, I'm going to be kind of sticking with this whole theme of a somewhat clueless girl trying to avoid a bad end, only this time it's not an Otome game, but rather it's kind of the French Revolution, honestly. And that's going to be volume number 1 of Tear Moon Empire. Spoiler, it's a really good book. I'm going to have lots of nice things to say about this one in that review. Hope you join me for that one. In the meantime, thanks for joining me in this review. I look forward to seeing you in my future videos. Till then, bye-bye for now.